The hearing will come to order. Welcome to the committee on the budget hearing on the Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Outlook. I want to thank everyone for being here this morning. We're holding this hearing today to discuss the Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Economic Outlook, which gives us a 10-year projection of our spending, our national debt, and how the economy is going to perform over the next decade. The report forms the cornerstone of the work we do here at the House Budget Committee, and I want to thank everyone at the CBO for their hard work in producing this report. I'd also like to welcome the CBO Director, Keith Hall. Director Hall, I do appreciate you taking the time to testify today, and I look forward to your insight as we discuss this report. The discussion we will have today is a serious one, because as CBO indicates, we face enormous fiscal and economic challenges. Deficits are beginning to rise again, and economic growth continues to be subpar. Legacies of the last administration's policies that encourage more spending, more debt, and more government. These challenges have a real impact on every person in this country. The numbers we're reviewing today affect the ability of every American to buy groceries, obtain a loan to start a small business, or to get a good return on their retirement plan. We know this to be the case because CBO's report is telling us of what would happen if we kept President Obama's policies in place. Without any changes to the current law, the deficit would rise from $587 billion in fiscal year 2016 to $1.4 trillion in fiscal year 2027. And during that same time period, our national debt will jump to $30 trillion. To put that in human terms, that's $93,000 for every American. And for a lot of folks, that's about what it costs to buy a home. CBO tells us that this ever-increasing debt spiral will hamper economic growth and consign the country to a lower standard of living. As a grandmother, I want my grandchildren to have every opportunity that I did. But on our current path, the dream of a good job or owning a home and sending their kids to college is becoming harder and harder. Much of this unsustainable fiscal path is driven by projected spending for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security over the next decade. But without reforms, these programs are going to fail our seniors who have worked hard and paid into them for their entire lives. To compound these problems, economic growth is set to average at a morbid 1.9% over the coming decade, well below the historic average of just over 3%. Slow economic growth hurts our country in multiple ways. It means fewer jobs and less opportunities for Americans. It means smaller paychecks and less financial security for those Americans who have a job. In fact, more than 5 million Americans are working part-time because they can't find a full-time job. That means that we've got welders, computer technicians, nurses, and people in all sorts of industries who want to contribute to our economy, but they're being let down by the rules and regulations coming out of Washington. The problem is particularly acute among men. One of the key symptoms of this subpar economic recovery has been the decline in the labor workforce participation rate of those of prime working age. And here's a story from a gentleman named Chris back in my own district in Tennessee. He said he was laid off just last year, and in his letter he said this to me, and I want to quote, "I worked at this job for 7 years, and I'm a hard worker, and have never tried for any government assistance. I'm positive I'll have a job soon, but I've been without a paycheck for months now, and if I have to wait any more, I will have no money for utilities or support for me, my wife, and 7-year-old. Now, it's pretty clear that Chris is exactly the type of worker that makes our economy the best in the world. And he is a good husband and father who wants to take care of his family. Chris wants to make our country stronger, and it's our job to help give him that opportunity. A job is so much more than the way we pay for a rent or put gas in our car. A job helps us to define ourselves. It gives people a sense of purpose. It helps to build communities, and it can break cycles of poverty. And when Americans have a steady job, they know the dignity of work. CBO's report tells us what will happen if we do nothing, but that is certainly not the only choice we have. We can choose to get our fiscal house back under control. We can choose to get our economy growing again so that it works for men and women of this country. And here at the House Budget Committee, that is exactly what we intend to do. Director Hall, thank you again for being here, and I look forward to your testimony and how it can help guide us in forming the best policies to hold the federal government accountable, grow our economy, and serve the American people. And with that, I yield to my ranking member, Mr. Yarmuth.
Thank you, Chairman Black, and thank you, Director Hall, for appearing before us today to outline CBO's updated economic and budget outlook. The long-term outlook remains troubling, of course. We're a few years away from an increase in federal deficits and debt driven by the increased health care and retirement costs of an older population. Your report outlines our circumstances as a new administration takes office. Total deficits over 10 years are essentially the same as you projected in August. You project this year's deficit to be lower than last year's and next year's to be lower still. And as your report says, the economy is currently on solid ground. That's a much better starting point than President Obama faced 8 years ago. President Obama inherited an economy in free fall. The country was in the midst of the deepest recession in generations, losing nearly 800,000 jobs per month. In its January 2009 outlook, CBO was projecting a deficit of more than $1 trillion, and the economy was projected to shrink by 2.2%. That turned out to be optimistic. In contrast, President Trump is inheriting a healthy economy. The economy has added 15.8 million private sector jobs since 2010. The unemployment rate is less than half its 2009 peak, and the budget deficit has fallen by more than $800 billion, a nearly two-thirds reduction as a share of the economy. This year's CBO report projects that the economy will grow at a 2.3% rate. Job creation will also grow at a steady rate, and the deficit will shrink over the next 2 years. What a difference 8 years makes. President Obama's economic agenda is also paying dividends on many other fronts. Tens of millions of Americans now have the economic security that comes with having health coverage and thereby being free from fears of an accident or illness sending them into bankruptcy. The stock market has tripled in value. The auto industry has recovered from a near-death experience. Manufacturing has added jobs for the first time since the 1990s, and wages have begun to grow at a healthy pace. The financial industry is better capitalized and more secure with stronger protections for consumers. We've dramatically reduced our dependence on foreign oil and increased our production of renewable energy. Housing prices have largely recovered, and millions of homeowners are no longer underwater on their mortgages. I could go on, and I probably should, because I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will present an alternative reality. I'm dealing in facts, and the fact is this Congress and the new Trump administration are getting ready to take our country down a far different path. Republican leadership is moving to repeal the Affordable Care Act with no plan to replace it. 32 million people will lose health coverage, premiums will double, and we will return to the days when insurance companies decide who lives and who dies. House Republicans are planning deep tax cuts and a rollback of financial protections. Recent Republican presidents have tried this approach. Each time, it resulted in skyrocketing deficits, a recession, and ultimately a financial crisis, the most recent of which brought our country to the brink of total collapse. I was briefed by Paulson and Bernanke in 2008. I know how close our nation came to having the lights go out. The American people cannot afford for us to make those same mistakes again. Finally, I want to raise the issue of immigration. It's been heart-wrenching to see the immediate impact of the President's executive order during the past week. It is discouraging that the first immigration action of this White House separated families, vilified the innocent, and will fail to make our nation safer by every logical measure. That being said, I was a member of the Gang of Eight in 2013, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. We drafted comprehensive immigration reform legislation that we were confident had the bipartisan votes to pass the House. The only thing missing was the political will of Republican leadership to bring it to the floor. Beyond addressing humanitarian and security needs, CBO has repeatedly told us that comprehensive immigration reform would mean a larger economy and a smaller budget deficit. It is my hope that my colleagues across the aisle will recognize these facts and enact the immigration reform we so desperately need. We can't solve the challenges we face as a nation, whether it's immigration, healthcare, the economy, or passing a congressional budget, without acknowledging what got us here and continuing on that path. To return to where we were and abandon all the progress we have made would be devastating, not just for American families today, but for generations to come. With that, Director Hall, I look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, I ask you to submit them for the record. I would like now to recognize the Director of the CBO, Dr. Keith Hall. Mr. Hall, thank you again for your time today, and the committee has received your written statement, and it will be made part of the formal hearing record. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. You may begin when you are ready.
Thank you. Chairman Black, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the Congressional Budget Office's most recent analysis of the outlook for the budget and for the economy. I will discuss a few highlights of our updated budget and economic projections, which were released last week. After my brief remarks, I will be happy to take your questions. The economic forecast that underlies CBO's budget projections indicates that in real terms, gross domestic product will expand at an average annual pace of 2.1% over the next 2 years, if current laws remain generally unchanged, after rising last year at an annual rate of 1.8%. We expect that growth to boost employment, virtually eliminate the remaining slack in the economy, and drop the unemployment rate to 4.4% by the fourth quarter of 2018. Further ahead, according to CBO's projections, GDP will expand at an average annual rate of 1.9% over the second half of the coming decade. That growth rate represents a significant slowdown from the average over the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, mainly because of the slower growth projected for the nation's supply of labor, which largely results from ongoing retirement of baby boomers and the relative stability in the labor force participation rate among working women. As slack diminishes over the next 2 years, we expect the rate of inflation to rise to the Federal Reserve's goal of 2% and to stay there on average. We also anticipate that the Federal Reserve will steadily raise the target for federal funds and that interest rates over the next few years will be significantly higher than they are now. CBO's current economic projections differ a bit from those it published in August 2016. The agency now expects GDP in 2016 to be modestly lower than it projected last summer. It also expects lower interest rates in the next 5 years, but projects a higher rate of labor force participation throughout the next decade than it projected in August. In fiscal year 2016, for the first time since 2009, the federal budget deficit increased in relation to GDP. CBO projects that over the next 10 years, if current laws remain generally unchanged, budget deficits would eventually follow an upward trajectory, the results of 3 main trends. First, strong growth in spending for retirement and health care programs targeted to older people, especially Social Security and Medicare. Second, rising interest payments on the government's debt. And third, modest growth in revenue collections. By the end of the period, the accumulating deficits would drive up debt held by the public from its already high level. Moreover, 3 decades from now, if current laws remain in place, that debt would be nearly twice as high relative to GDP as it is this year, and would reach a higher percentage than any previously recorded. Such high and rising debt would have serious negative consequences for the budget and the nation, including an increased risk of a fiscal crisis. Our estimate of the deficit for 2017 is lower than our August estimate, primarily because we now expect lower mandatory spending. The current projection of the cumulative deficit for the 2017 to 2026 period, however, is about the same as we published in August. I'm often asked specifically about our projections for Medicaid and federal subsidies for health insurance purchased through the marketplaces established by the Affordable Care Act. By CBO's estimates, an average of 12 million people under the age of 65 will have health insurance in any given month in 2017 as a result of the expansion of Medicaid under the ACA. In addition, CBO and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation estimate that this year, 9 million people per month on average will receive subsidies for non-group coverage purchased through the marketplaces. An additional 1 million people are projected to be covered by unsubsidized insurance purchased through the marketplaces. We estimate that 27 million people under the age of 65 will be uninsured on average in 2017. CBO and JCT currently estimate that in 2017, federal spending for people made eligible for Medicaid covered by the ACA will be $70 billion, and that net federal subsidies for coverage obtained through the marketplaces will be $45 billion. For the entire 10-year period, 2018 to 2027, if current laws remain in place, those two types of costs would total $1.9 trillion. It is important to note that CBO's baseline is not intended to be a forecast of what will happen. Rather, it's meant to provide a neutral benchmark that policymakers can use to assess the potential effects of policy decisions. CBO's budget and economic projections are predicated on the assumption that the laws that are currently governing federal taxes and spending generally remained in place for the entire projection period. Even if that occurred, there were no changes in those laws before the end of the period, it would still not be possible to predict budgetary and economic outcomes precisely because many other factors are uncertain. Our goal is to construct budget and economic projections that fall in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes, given both the fiscal policy embodied in current law and the availability of economic and other data. I'd now be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. And now we will begin the question and answer session. And if I could ask the staff to bring up Figure 1 for my first question. Mr. Hall, CBO's economic forecast has been trending sharply downward in the recent years, and roughly 5 years ago, CBO was expecting real GDP growth to average around 3% over the 10-year budget horizon, close to that long-term average growth rate that we've seen here in the U.S. That figure has been dropping consistently, and in this latest forecast, it's down to just 1.9%. So it seems that CBO is expecting that the U.S. economy will experience a protracted economic malaise for at least the next decade under current policies. So two questions I have for you. First of all, what are the reasons for CBO keep ratcheting down its projections for the GDP growth? And secondly, how will this much lower expected growth path affect our federal budget?
The look forward over the next 10 years, we do expect the slack in the economy to be virtually eliminated over the next 2 years. So we'll be on what we think is sort of the potential growth of GDP. And what's constraining the potential growth of GDP, as we forecast, is something like 1.8, 1.9%. It's a combination of a more slowly growing labor force. A lot of that is an aging population as baby boomers retire. Not all of it, however, and slower productivity growth. Since the end of the recession, productivity growth has only been 0.8%, so it's less than 1% productivity growth. We expect that will go up by the end of the period to something like 1.3%, but that's still lower than it has been in the past. So in fact, if you sort of take that labor force of growing of 0.5%, productivity growing 1.3%, add those together, that 1.8%, 1.9% is about our economic forecast. And so the challenges are slower growing labor force and slower growing productivity going forward. And again, we have this issue with baby boomers in particular that we've seen coming for a long time. It's just starting to get closer and closer now.
How do you expect what you're projecting up here to affect the federal budget?
Well, this is going to have an impact. This is going to make it's going to contribute probably to the growth in the deficit going forward. Something like productivity, for example, which is part of what's at the heart here, has a pretty significant impact on our budget forecast. So if we get some increase, for example, in productivity, we'll have a smaller growing deficit, but the problem is so big that even that's not really going to solve the problem.
So to the other end of that, and coupled with this sluggish economy, is the relentless rise in our government spending and deficits. And your figures show that the tax revenues are already above the 50-year average as a percentage of GDP and are projected to keep growing, and yet our spending keeps growing faster. If we tried to balance the budget just by raising taxes, how would a big tax increase, how big would the tax increase be required to be in order to be able to catch up?
Well, just to give you some idea, we've actually got a great little figure 1.7. And it gives you some idea of the size of the deficit relative to the size of things like revenues and discretionary spending and et cetera. We see the deficit in 10 years is going to be about $1.4 trillion. It's about 5% of GDP, and total revenues are going to be about 18% of GDP in 10 years. So it's a major chunk of revenues right now. So that would be a pretty significant increase in revenues to get there.
Any idea of what percent we'd have to increase taxes in order to be able to get there?
We haven't done a scenario like that.
But significant is
but
what you're
it would
saying.
be significant, and it would probably also significantly change our economic forecast as well, so it makes it particularly complicated.
So even for those who would favor some combination of spending restraint and tax increases, is it fair to say that getting control of spending is really indispensable in this equation to overcome those chronic deficits and debt?
Well, that seems to be the picture. The growing deficit and the growing debt is so large, it's hard to imagine just picking on either revenues or outlays and not looking at both things. And the broader you look, the smaller the change you need. So if you restrict yourself to just smaller buckets, for example, just discretionary spending, you've really got to reduce discretionary spending. So that's clearly one of the features here that we see is this is a really big hole to fill.
So on the other side of that, if we could achieve a more robust degree of economic growth, say something closer to that historic average of just a little over 3%, how much would that help us in shrinking those deficits?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of an idea. We don't have GDP in here, but we have a little scenario with productivity growth. Mm-hmm. For every 1/10 of a percentage point in productivity growth, we see the deficit in 10 years shrinking by about $50 billion. So something like an increase in productivity of a half a percentage point would be pretty significant. And that's going to reduce the deficit by about $250 million, and that's out of a $1.4 trillion deficit. So that makes a difference, but it's even a half a percentage point isn't enough to balance the budget essentially in 10 years.
Let me go to another topic. Let's go to Figure 2, please. One of the most troubling aspects of our CBO's outlook is the stubbornly low rate of labor workforce participation. That rate now stands at 62.7%, close to a 40-year low. And CBO expects this to continue declining over this next decade, which is just really disappointing. Obviously, the ongoing retirement of baby boomers generation plays a key role, but CBO also states that government policies are exacerbating the trend. Is it correct that the labor force is a key component of economic growth, and how large does that role play? And second to that is, what are some of the policies that do affect this, and how do they create incentives for work?
Sure. I'd say if you look at the long-run growth of the economy, long-run health of the economy, you can look at two different things. You can look at labor force growth, and you can look at productivity growth. If you compare our growth that we see over the next 10 years to what we had in the 1990s, when we had 3.3% GDP, the slowdown in labor force growth is about half that difference. So it's pretty significant. And you're right, although baby boomers retiring is a source of that decline in labor force participation, we also have lower labor force participation by every cohort in the United States. And that's certainly one of the targets, I think, for having a sort of a supply-side impact that raises potential GDP, is doing things to increase the labor force participation by working-age people.
And what kind of policies can we initiate to change this trajectory?
Well, certainly we've identified, and we often do, we point out what amounts to implicit taxes on work. There are a number of things that are implicit taxes on work where we reduce benefits when income goes up. The ACA itself probably reduces labor force participation. That's a drag as well. There are a number of things like that. I don't want to get too specific about it, but just the sort of things that will get people back into the workforce are things that will help that labor force participation and help this potential GDP growth problem that we have.
I do thank you for all of your comments on this, and I will go back to my opening remarks as I conclude my time, that it really bothers me so much that we have people who are out of the workforce, because I know from my career and my children and so on that work is good for the soul. And I often tell people that after you ask someone, you say, hello, this is my name, what is the second question you ask them? What do you do? And if you are productive and you're feeling good about your work and what you're contributing to society, that overall helps the entire society. And so this is, for me, even more about how we have our society grow as a society that is whole and healthy, as much as it is in what it will do to help keep the economy going. All of this together is what makes our country great. Thank you, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Chairman Black. I'm going to defer my questions till later in the hearing. And
Who came into the room? Oh, it's coming. Okay, would you like to yield to one of your members?
Sure, I'd like to.
No, that was here first. I'm gonna let you
All right,
make
Mr.
the decision.
Jeffries from New York was here first, so we'll yield to him.
Mr. Jeffries, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank the distinguished ranking member for yielding. Statement was made earlier that we can choose to get the economy working again. I want to pursue that for a moment because I think that the economy has been working ever since the turnaround that was engineered by the previous president 8 years ago. Isn't it in fact the case that when Barack Obama came into office, this country was in a mess and in the danger of total collapse?
Well, that's right. We were undergoing significant job loss and decline in GDP growth.
Stock market was a mess, correct?
Yes.
Automobile industry a mess, correct? Banking industry a mess, correct?
Yes.
401ks a mess, correct?
Yes.
Housing market a mess, correct?
Yes.
And since 2010, this country has gained more than 15 million private sector jobs. Is that right?
I think that's right.
8 years ago, the stock market was about 6,000. Is that right?
That sounds right.
And now it's over 19,000. Is that correct?
Yes.
8 years ago, the unemployment rate was at over 10%. Is that right?
Yes.
And now it's under 5%. Is that correct?
Yes.
The deficit has been reduced by more than $1 trillion over the last 8 years, correct?
That sounds right.
Okay, so this statement about getting the economy working again, I think perhaps is inaccurate as a snapshot of what actually has occurred over the last 8 years. And so it seems that what we need to do is build upon the tremendous progress that has been made under the leadership of Barack Obama and keep this country moving forward. I would also note on this question of whether we should cooperate with the new president that Barack Obama was able to lead an economic turnaround without an ounce of cooperation from the other side, who decided to pursue an agenda of obstruction today, obstruction tomorrow, obstruction forever over the last 8 years. And so hopefully we can find ourselves in a situation where we move forward in a cooperative fashion in a way that benefits all of America. In terms of our present situation, the CBO expects that economic growth will be sluggish over the next decade. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in part, that's because of a decline in labor force participation, correct?
That's correct.
Now, would the retirement that will continue of baby boomers out of the labor workforce exacerbate this problem in a way that will continue to provide modest, if not sluggish, economic growth moving forward over the next 10 years?
That's right. It's almost certainly going to happen, and it's certainly going to be a difficulty in achieving higher economic growth.
And this is a problem that Japan, for instance, which had a booming economy in the 1980s, is experiencing today. Is that true?
That's true.
And one of the reasons why Japan is experiencing that problem is because they got very harsh immigration policies and they don't have the natural growth from their own population that would lead to robust participation in the labor force. Is that right?
Yes.
So there was a comprehensive immigration reform bill that I think was passed by the Senate in 2013. Mr. Yarmouth mentioned it, worked hard to get it enacted into law here in the House, but due to the politics of the situation, it did not go anywhere. I believe the CBO studied that particular piece of legislation and concluded that over about a 20-year period, it would reduce the deficit, I think, by $700 billion. Is that right?
That sounds right.
So it would have a positive impact, comprehensive immigration reform, on our economic situation, correct?
That's right. It's primarily through increased growth in the labor force. So, and that's one of the primary constraints going forward is the growth in the labor force.
And one of the ways that we can deal with the labor force moving forward is to make sure that our immigration policies continue to welcome individuals who come to America, work hard, will contribute to the labor force, since we aren't naturally able to produce the numbers that would result in increased economic productivity. Is that a fair statement?
It probably is, although keep in mind the effects of any particular labor immigration policy can be complicated, so we'd have to sort of see exactly what's being proposed. But there is one constant, and that it does affect the labor supply, and that labor supply does help GDP growth.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Director, for your testimony. It's always good to have you here. I want to focus in on this trend line in terms of the deficit just a little bit. And if I may, we, as you know, think of the federal budget in two different pots: discretionary and mandatory spending. Mandatory being primarily Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the classic quote-unquote entitlement programs. What's been the trend line on discretionary spending over the last few years?
Well, discretionary spending is looking like it's going to decline as a share of GDP. It's been declining. So, in fact, while we look forward to the next 10 years and see spending increase really significantly, discretionary spending is not increasing significantly. And that, in fact, is declining as a share of GDP.
As a share of GDP, and since '09, it's actually declined very substantially in real terms, just as an amount. I mean, we're actually spending considerably less on the discretionary portions of the budget. And that's everything from defense to NASA to National Institute of Health than we were in '09 and '10. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Well, give us the trend line, if you would, on mandatory spending. Again, the classic entitlement programs. What's that trend been in the last 5 or 6 years? Where do you see it going over the next decade?
Well, mandatory spending continues to grow faster than GDP, quite a bit faster. Even, the revenues are growing as a share of GDP, but spending, especially mandatory spending, is growing a lot faster. So it's sort of a race that mandatory spending is winning in adding to the deficit going forward.
And are there any significant proposals out there on either side of the aisle to change the direction of that, or slow it down, manage it a little bit better? Nothing
comes to mind. One of the things I like to point out, we've just produced something called Options for Reducing the Deficit. It's sort of a nice thick volume with over 100 options, and we give you some options on things like mandatory spending and other things that you can look at for reducing the deficit going forward. It gives you some idea of how much of an impact those different options would have.
When's the last time we had significant reform in, let's say, Social Security?
I think it's been a while. I mean, there have been some. I'm not an expert in Social Security. There have been some adjustments and benefits and delaying eligibility, some things like that. But they still haven't affected the long run problem that we've seen coming for decades. It's still coming.
I think the last time we really made much progress in this area was actually very bipartisan. It was with President Reagan, and the House was Democratic in that period. Tip O'Neill, Howard Baker in the Senate. In other words, they came together, set up a commission, and extended the life of Social Security fairly dramatic in the middle 80s. We haven't really gone back and done too much since then. Is that correct, as you recall?
That's correct.
I say this in a very self-serving way because my friend, Mr. Delaney on the other side, and I have a bill that would set up another commission that would be by nature bipartisan. It would be 7 and 6, which we actually have introduced it in a couple of Congresses. 7 members chosen effectively by the president and the majority party, 6 by the minority, but you'd have to have 9 votes to actually report something to Congress. Congress would then have about 60 days to vote it up or down. And I would invite my colleagues on both sides of the aisle just to look at that legislation, because I think if you read the numbers, which you so accurately and persuasively put out here, sooner or later we have to address mandatory spending. Neither side in the last campaign did that in any meaningful way. Neither side, frankly, in the House and the Senate has actually advanced legislation. We actually always write a budget that addresses this, and I hope we do that again, Madam Chairman. I hope we don't ignore the elephant in the room, so to speak, and I'm sure we won't under your leadership, and my good friend, the ranking member, I know has these same concerns. But I know I'm not using the question, but I do want to finish, and then I'll yield back. I just would invite my colleagues, we can score points against one another all day. We both have great arguments and great talking points. This is a problem we could solve. It's a math problem. It's not as tough as Medicare and Medicaid. We literally could sit down and negotiate this through, just as President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill did, and Howard Baker. And I would invite us to begin that process, because I don't like the way your numbers look at the end of the decade. With that, I yield back. I thank you very much. I thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd just like to begin by echoing the comments from Representative Cole, because I think you're right. Sometimes people ask me about what it's like to serve on the Budget Committee, and I say it's often a great place for people who don't do math. If we started doing math, we could solve a lot of problems. So thank you, Mr. Cole. Director Hall, as I'm sure you know, immigration has become a major topic of discussion following President Trump's executive order last week. Now, there's a lot of evidence that the order is unconstitutional, and it's certainly hurting our national security overseas. Secretary Mattis and others have made that clear. But it's also having a detrimental impact on our economy here at home. The concern, of course, is that with this executive order, the Trump administration is scaring away some of the very people we need to continue growing the economy as our labor force shrinks. Now, many of America's major corporations and businesses were founded by immigrants. For example, Steve Jobs, his father came from Syria. And apparently, more than half of the current crop of US-based startups valued at $1 billion or more. So more than half of the current startups with a valuation of $1 billion or more. Collectively, these 44 companies are valued at $168 billion. They were started by immigrants. So $168 billion of valuation, creating 33,440 jobs in the U.S. market. And immigrants in these companies make up more than 70% of key management or product development positions. So we've heard in the past week CEOs from Facebook, Starbucks, Goldman Sachs, and other leaders in the business community who have already stated that this ban will hurt their ability to attract and retain talent, and that it may spur people or companies to discount the U.S. as a place to pursue business and investment opportunities. College and universities have also raised alarms, including those in my district, about the impact that this will have on students and faculty who hail from the 7 countries targeted by the order. In 2016, international students in the U.S. colleges surpassed 1 million for the first time, contributing more than $32 billion a year to our economy. $32 billion a year, Madam Chair, would certainly help with our budget deficit. That's the kind of consumer spending that we need because it creates jobs. So I want to speak briefly about the impact on our healthcare system, because more than a quarter of the physician workforce in the U.S. comes from other countries, with more than 8,400 doctors working in the U.S. from 2 countries listed in the executive order, Syria and Iran alone. Now, we want those talented doctors to be here, saving American lives and helping our healthcare system at a time of physician shortage. America does not currently produce enough physicians to keep up with demand. We have a current deficit of over 8,200 primary care doctors. So that deficit would literally double if the doctors from Iran and Syria were not here. And so, Director Hall, I know you can't speak directly to the effects of this executive order as it was just released, but based on the 2013 CBO report on immigration reform and other work that CBO has done on this issue, can you talk in general terms about the impact that such restrictive immigration policies might have on the growth of our economy?
Sure. Well, you raise an interesting aspect of immigration. And one of the reasons why we really kind of need to see specific proposals is because the type of proposal has different kinds of effects. The evidence is, for example, that increased immigration of unskilled workers probably has an effect of lowering wages for lower skilled workers in the United States. However, when you go to the skilled workers, they in fact increase productivity because, as you say, there are a lot of entrepreneurs, et cetera, who are immigrants or skilled immigrants. So that has sort of a different sort of side effect.
Right, and if you look at the countries in the order, countries like Iran and Syria, are they mostly skilled or unskilled workers who are coming to the U.S. from these countries?
I don't know offhand.
It's mostly skilled workers, disproportionately entrepreneurs and business people. Thank you. So please continue.
Okay, sure. Sure, so you know, if you look at immigration proposals, it makes a difference if you're just going to broadly increase immigration. If you're going to increase immigration that's focused more on skilled workers, that has sort of a different effect than if it's unskilled workers. I mean, the fundamental that it increases the labor supply is there. It's sort of the other effects that depend upon exactly who's emigrating. And then, of course, the size needs to be pretty significant. It's not clear that the executive order, that at least from what I've seen, that's large enough to make us change our forecast.
Thank you, sir.
The gentleman's time
Madam
has
Chair.
expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. There seem to be two dominant themes coming from my friends across the aisle. One is that the Obama economy has been wonderful, and second, we need more foreign immigration to compete for American jobs. As to the first, I'd give them the same advice I tried to offer them at our last meeting on Obamacare. Every American has an up-close and personal experience with the economy. They know what's going on in their own lives. And any politician who tries to convince them otherwise looks downright foolish. Some people are doing very well in the Obama economy. Most people are not. If most people were doing well in this economy, the Democrats would not have lost 67 U.S. House seats, 13 U.S. Senate seats, 11 U.S. governors, and more than 900 state legislative seats, not to mention the presidency over the past 4 election cycles. Just a word of unsolicited advice. Second, with respect to foreign immigration, our foreign immigration over the last decade has been unprecedented. If my friends were correct, this should be the golden age of the American economy. The impact has been very clear: badly depressed wages for working families and the lowest labor participation rate since Jimmy Carter. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is what Admiral Mike Mullen warned us was, in his professional military judgment, the greatest single threat to our national security, and that was our nation's debt. And that warning was issued about 5 years and about $4 trillion of debt ago. You report that the debt held by the public this year is 77%, but actually our total debt is well over 100% of our gross domestic product, is it not?
Well, we look at debt held by the public because that's the important debt.
I know you
for the
do, but
economy.
I think that's highly deceptive. The difference is mainly because Social Security, as it runs chronic deficits, we pay back what we borrowed by going to the public for further borrowing. So what we've got in that overall debt number is, in effect, converting intragovernmental debt into debt held by the public. Isn't that what's going on?
Well, that's right. To get to your number.
So we're
yes,
deceptively understating the problem, since unless we change the law, that gross debt, which is now over 100% of GDP, is destined to become debt held by the public over the next few years. Isn't that correct?
Well, let me put it this way. The debt held by the public is going to grow really significantly.
It's already baked into our total debt. We're simply converting the debt we owe to Social Security by borrowing from the public. That's already in those numbers. As long as Social Security continues its chronic deficit, that's going to continue. And that's going to require a change in law, is it not?
That would, yes.
So we're already approaching uncharted territory for this nation. And the question I have is that on our current trajectory, are we courting a sovereign debt crisis?
We are, and one of the difficulties is
What does
I
that
can't tell you
crisis look
exactly.
like?
Well, as the debt continues to grow, interest rates, when they go back up to normal ranges, we're going to have a major share of our budget just paying off interest. So that's going to be a real drain.
So would that affect our ability to provide basic services?
It will. It's going to reduce flexibility.
Would it imperil our ability to respond to a military challenge on the magnitude that we faced after Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, absolutely. Our ability to spend money is going to be
How
really
would it
limited.
affect our overall economy?
Well, part of what's going to happen is this is a drag. This is an increase of interest rates. A lot of federal borrowing crowds out private borrowing, so we actually have lower
In other
economic growth.
words, when the federal government borrows a dollar, it borrows it from that same capital market that would otherwise be available to loan to consumers to make consumer purchases, to businesses to expand jobs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Home buyers to buy new homes.
That's correct.
Taxes are often suggested as an antidote to debt, but aren't debt and taxes the same thing? I mean, after we've spent a dollar, haven't we already decided to tax it? The only question is whether we tax it now through current taxes or borrow it now and tax it later through future taxes.
Yeah, we certainly sort of constantly remind you that however you do it, whether you raise taxes or spending or et cetera, a lot of the stuff, it depends on how you pay for it. Whether you let the deficit grow or not makes a big
Well, but
impact.
the deficit's just a future tax. We borrow it now and we pay it back through future taxes. It's all, in other words, isn't to borrow from the Clinton maxim, isn't it the spending stupid?
Well, certainly spending is the biggest single problem going forward. The rate of spending exceeds the
Thank
tax
you.
rate.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Delbeni, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Director Hall, thank you for being with us. My district in Washington State has a northern border and is also home to, I'm pretty sure, nearly every point of view on every issue, most of the time. But one key difference has been immigration reform. We've heard from business community, farmers, faith-based community, folks in travel and tourism, law enforcement, all asking for the need for comprehensive immigration reform. And I was one of the folks who led the bill that we introduced in the House in the 113th Congress, similar to the one that passed the Senate, that the CBO has said would have a significant impact in reducing the deficit, about $700 billion in the second decade. I think you confirmed that was the correct number.
That sounds right.
But when we look at individual sectors, and when I was elected and talking to our farmers, they said we need two things. We need a farm bill and we need comprehensive immigration reform. And we got a farm bill, and folks have said we're not sure we can stay in business if we don't have immigration reform. If you look at a sector like agriculture, do you see lack of immigration reform as actually having a negative impact on economic growth?
We haven't looked at it at that sort of. We haven't done that sort of analysis. We'd have to do a little work to.
Well, I can tell you that farmers definitely feel that way, and it's an incredibly important issue, and the reckless executive order has not helped and has impacted many people's lives and has only continued to have a negative impact. Before coming to Congress, I was a businesswoman and entrepreneur. I also ran the Department of Revenue for the state of Washington. And since coming to Congress, I've been very frustrated with our budget and appropriations process, with how they don't work. In particular, we seem to live off of continuing resolutions, and you would never run a business 30 or 60 days at a time, and you definitely, it's no way to budget. It's probably the most expensive and least efficient way to budget. But we also, and with sequestration on top of that, we end up looking at folks that have been focused on cuts, but not on return on investment. And I know that sometimes spending money on important projects actually saves you money in the long run, and we get a great return. I was wondering, when you look at your models and look at things like infrastructure, research, and education, how does our lack of investment in those areas impact our future growth?
Well, I think the research is fairly clear that generally federal investment does increase productivity, and it does have an impact on growth. The research is pretty incomplete in that identifying the different kinds of investment is difficult, what the rates of return are on different kinds of investment. One of the big things, though, about increasing investment is really depends upon how you pay for it. If you increase investment and reduce spending in another spot, so you don't have a net impact on spending, that's a much more positive impact on the economy than if you let a deficit grow.
But if we, for example, have a pothole in the road and we don't fix it, and it might have cost a certain amount to fix that pothole, next time, because we didn't fix it, we end up having to replace the road bed. We end up spending a lot more because we didn't make that investment early on. Isn't that a fair point of view when we look at a lot of these issues that we aren't funding or providing those investments because we don't have a normal budget or appropriations process? Isn't that hurting our ability to see progress in those areas?
Well, that's right. Federal investment, anything that sort of helps companies be more productive, move products around, encourage innovation, that does help productivity, and that's obviously one of our big problems going forward. One of the issues is it's a little bit like, in my mind, a little bit like cutting taxes. They both can stimulate the economy, and depends on how they work. They both can affect long-term growth. The question a little bit is how much. An investment, federal investment in particular, there's often a big delay, and there is some impact on interest rates. And that impact on interest rates does raise the cost of debt in the economy. So it's not quite so clear, for example, that if you just increase federal investment, don't pay for it, let the deficit grow, that probably does not have a net positive on the economy. It's probably
But also negative. Just cutting and not investing in programs that give us a great return has a negative impact too. And I think that's our role, is to decide what is giving us a great return and making sure we're making those investments, seeing what's not working and not making those investments. And continuing resolutions and sequestration are us not taking that responsibility seriously here and not making those decisions and making the investments in the right way that need to be made. Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Madam Chair.
The lady's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Renacci, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's interesting. First, I want to go back to my colleague, Mr. Cole, and say the exact same thing. We could sit here all day and fire bullets back and forth on political issues, but that's not going to solve the issues of the day, because the issue of the day is that we have to get a budget, and we have to live with a budget. And before we can even get a budget, we have to figure out where we're at, which is another problem around here. I have mentioned since day one that we don't have a complete record of financial information, because we don't allow for all of our debts to be added up, and we don't use the information we have then to make decisions, and then we don't look at the past of the decisions we made. As a business guy for 30 years, and actually a business guy that took over 60 failed businesses and successfully turned them around, you have to see where you're at first before you can go forward. So my frustration always builds when we start to get into these political talking points, because everybody's district's going to have issues that concern them. My district, I can tell you, the businesses, the people, the individuals are all concerned about tax reform, regulation reform, and Obamacare reform. So again, it's not what the district, it's what we can do as far as putting a budget together and getting things moving. But Dr. Hall, don't we have the record revenues in the Treasury over the last few years?
That's right. Well, I'm not sure the record. They're certainly above average right now, and they're going to actually go up as a share of GDP, so we don't have declining revenues.
Right. So we have record revenues, and in my business world, what I would find if you had record revenues, you were really doing really well, except when you had record expenditures that were exceeding those record revenues. And I heard you say earlier that one of our issues is that we are spending, our biggest problem really is our spending problem. Would you agree?
Well, yes, that's the major contributor to the deficit.
So until we come together as Republicans and Democrats and realize we have spending issues and we're not going to tax our way out of this, and we can put a budget together, I think that's the starting point that I hope at some point this committee can get to, having a good, solid budget that then we live with. My concerns, again, it's extremely alarming that our interest in our national debt is projected to nearly quadruple to $768 billion in 2027. It appears that as numbers continue to grow, we're going to have less, and the time is now to start looking at our spending side, because if we just sit back and start saying the last president was great, the president before that was great, and we don't do anything, we're going to be in a deeper, deeper hole in the next few years. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sooner we get to solving the deficit problem, whether it's spending or whether it's taxes or anything, but the sooner we start to address that, the less of a change it's going to be, the easier it's going to be to try to deal with it.
Well, and I think the sooner we recognize it, it's one of the reasons why I introduced the fiscal state of the nation, which would require the Comptroller General to come before the House and Senate, a joint session of Congress. I had almost 170 co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats. I'd actually hope that new members here would join me as we've refiled that bill. But do you agree that it would be a good starting point to have someone, the Comptroller General, come before the House and Senate and explain our growing deficits and our where the numbers are occurring and what's going on, so we have a starting point?
Well, absolutely. Hopefully we're providing some of that information to you, but yes.
I understand. And that's what you're doing here today. But I think the importance is, as we continue to look at these numbers, we have to start to realize that the growth of our federal debt is another issue concerns me, and I heard one of my colleagues earlier talk about this. If we do nothing, I think the federal deficit is projected to grow, if we just stay on the same track, $9.6 trillion in the next 10 years. Is that correct?
That's right.
So these are all issues that I hope that our colleagues, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle can start talking about as to ways we can work together to come up with a solution and a budget. I also have another bill which I think is so important. When we pass a budget, we should follow a budget. We've had a budget act since 1974. Most people don't realize that even though we pass budgets, we never follow them. Members from this committee, other committees come to the floor, pass bills that break the budget. If we're ever going to make things work, we have to come up with a solid budget and live with that budget and not break the budget. So I'm hoping that we can continue to work forward with these numbers. I appreciate the information. There's plenty of information in your report if everybody takes the time to read them. We are not going in a great direction. We do not have a healthy economy. We have what I would call we have an anemic economy. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would do well to stop patting themselves on the back for and take credit for voters putting them in the majority rather than the cartographers and map drawers who did a really good job of partisan gerrymandering, Mr. McClintock, to ensure that the scales are tipped in favor in virtually every state, particularly the states where Republicans hold a majority, and voters are not able to choose their legislators, but rather legislators choose their voters. And that's reflected in the brimming sea of diversity that we see in this committee on the other side of the aisle as opposed to our side of the aisle. And that also is reflective of the difference dramatically in the policies that result in how we govern. So please spare us the political advice. That having been said, I think it's important to note that Mr. Hall indicated that the slack in our economy is mainly attributed to the available labor force, largely attributed, as you said, Mr. Hall, to retirement of baby boomers and the stability of women in the workforce. Is that right?
Well, that's right. And by stability, I mean that in the 1990s, we had this great period of where women's labor force participation was growing very quickly, and we had significantly more economic growth as a result. And they've sort of closed that gap, and it's now sort of holding. So we're no longer getting that faster growth.
But you did indicate in your opening statement that primarily the slack in the economy is attributed to those two things.
Well, right, and really I think I was trying to refer to the potential growth, the long-term growth of the economy. But yes, I did talk about those two things.
Thank you. Our former CUBO director, Douglas Elmendorf, in a recent talk noted that under the current caps on annual appropriations, federal investment in infrastructure, R&D, education, and training will soon be smaller relative to GDP than at any time in the last 50 years. That he said that is not forward-looking, growth-oriented budget policy. Just to maintain the traditional level of investment as a percentage of the economy requires a substantial increase in the caps on appropriations. The caps on appropriations, wouldn't you agree, are a large part of what limits our ability to see growth in the economy.
It's certainly been the limit on the discretionary spending growth. That's been part of why it looks to be declining over the next 10 years.
With the Budget Control Act of 2011 and sequestration, we've continued to see dramatic cuts in non-defense discretionary spending, dramatic cuts. In 2010, non-defense discretionary spending was 4.5% of GDP. 2016, it was 3%. It is projected that in 2027, non-defense discretionary spending will only be 2.4% of GDP. And furthermore, investment in infrastructure as a percent of GDP has dropped from 0.8% in 1980 to 0.5% in 2015. Investment in research has dropped from 1% in 1965 to 0.4% of GDP in 2013. And finally, investment for education and training programs has dropped from 1% of GDP in 1975 to 0.5% in 2013. Director Hall, do you agree with your predecessor that capping investment in research, infrastructure, and education is incompatible with a budget policy that promotes growth in the American economy? And shouldn't we aim each year to include a certain percentage of spending on discretionary programs that promote economic growth, especially given the President's Muslim ban, which will, among other things, keep thought leaders in research and development out of our country and hurt our economy?
I wouldn't make a recommendation, but I will say that increasing federal investment is one of the tools you have for increasing potential GDP growth, because it does increase productivity of labor going forward.
And wouldn't you say that generally taking a balanced approach, which is what Democrats have promoted over the last 8 years, to responsible spending cuts and generating revenue, is the most responsible way to address deficits over a period of time? And wouldn't you also say that when it comes to dealing with our debt, that there is a dramatically negative impact on our overall economy when we threaten, as a Congress, to potentially not pay our bills?
I certainly say, however Congress decides to address the deficit, if they address it in a broader fashion, they need to make less dramatic changes in any one thing. So that does seem like that's a strategy certainly Congress could take.
Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Lewis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Hall, for being here today. Talk a little bit about federal investment or federal spending. In 2002, the federal budget was $2 trillion. Today, it is $3.4 trillion. To your numbers, the 50-year average is about 18.4% of revenues. We're well above that now and headed above that. Outlays, however, are well above the 50-year average as well, correct?
That's correct.
The top 1% of income earners, if we're going to look at revenues to balance this budget, the top 1% of income earners right now pay about $543 billion in income taxes. If that is less than this year's deficit, correct?
I think that's right. I don't know the numbers exactly, but that sounds about right.
My question is this. I don't think we have a revenue problem. If you look at these numbers, again, we're above the 50-year average of 18.4% and moving higher than that. How would we do that if you're just going to raise revenue? I mean, there isn't enough money at the top, is there?
Yeah, we haven't done any really specific analysis of that, but you're right. Putting it all in revenues makes it a pretty significant revenue increase. Just like putting it all in outlays involves a pretty dramatic outlay drop. So sort of spreading it out is a different sort of strategy.
You're servicing the debt, net interest on the debt, $768 billion, larger than the defense budget, for instance, I believe, in the next 10 years. What are you basing that on with regard to interest rates? I think the post-World War II 10-year Treasury average is around 5.7%. We're way down now at 2.4%.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that calculation?
Well, first of all, interest rates have been really low. We have interest rates climbing up into somewhat their historical range, but we're still kind of at the lower end of that range. So we're somewhere over 3% eventually on the interest rates. And that's a really important point, to be honest, because we're at a pretty low interest rate relative to history. And in fact, if interest rates go up by more...
Or back to their average.
Or back to their average. Let me give you an example. If interest rates were 1 percentage point higher over this 10-year period than our projection, we're talking about adding $1.6 trillion to the debt over that time period. And that's a lot of money for just 1 percentage point. So that's one of the more important things in our forecast.
So the net interest payments of $768 billion in the next 10 years, or in 10 years, is based on historically low interest rates.
That's correct.
Let's talk a little bit about Japan. I'm not an expert on their immigration policy, but I don't know that it's changed remarkably, but I do know their economy has hit this deflationary spiral. So I'm not certain if you've got the same policy in one particular area, but all of a sudden you go into a tailspin, that you can blame that policy. But what you might be able to look at is credit expansion. And we've had a very similar experience here, where we've monetized a lot of debt, where we've let the credit expansion go, created asset bubbles, so some would say, on the monetary side. Is it your experience, or I don't want to ask your opinion, but your analysis, that Japan is suffering a debt lag, that we've created so much debt that they can't grow their way out? And is that a danger for America, as far from a hyperinflationary scenario, stuck in a debt spiral and stuck with deflation and low growth?
I'm afraid I don't know enough about Japan and Japan's
Makes
policies.
two of us.
Okay. So it would be hard. We can follow up with some description, if you like, on Japan and what's been happening there.
I mean, there's a reason for these low growth rates. And you know, we've created money, created fiat money. We've certainly engaged in federal spending. We look at those figures I just cited, well above historical means. So why the low growth rates?
Again, I don't know enough about Japan to offer an opinion.
I would suggest that, you know, the reason we haven't hit 3% growth for 11 straight quarters, the reason that during the Reagan robust recovery, even the Clinton robust recovery, where we had growth of 5, 6, 7%, is the level of debt today, that we are stuck. Our balance sheets don't look so good, and when you're trying to service that kind of debt, it's very hard to grow out of it.
Yeah, I'll just say one of the most remarkable things that's going on now, and has since the end of the recession, has been very low productivity growth at 0.8%. And we don't understand that very well. And that's been a major headwind.
One final point quickly, Dr. Hall, and thanks again for coming. But when we fund federal investment, where does that money come from? It comes out of the private sector, some of that which would be private investment, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you, sir. I lead about my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm listening to the discussion here, which is thoughtful, and I believe that, people truly are sincere in their beliefs about the performance of the American economy and the policies that we in Congress are responsible for enacting to help influence, hopefully, economic growth. And I think there are two very different views of it. The good thing about the economy is, policy either works or it doesn't. It's not ideological, it's arithmetical. And if you look at the performance under various administrations relative to the policies that they advance, the measure of their effectiveness or lack of effectiveness is the performance of the economy. Now, it's been referenced here that in the waning days of the last Bush administration, a decision was made to enact tax cuts that disproportionately benefited higher wage earners, people that make a lot of money. The theory, it's trickle down, it's supply side, it's call it what you will, is it because if they save money because of tax policy, that money will find its way back into the economy in new business investment and job growth. That's the theory. That is indisputable. That's what they say. Job growth during the George W. Bush administration was the lowest level in the past 75 years. In the waning days, the economy went into a very severe contraction. In March of 2009, the stock market was at 5,600. We were losing 600,000 jobs a month. The auto industry was a disaster. The U.S. and world financial markets were falling apart. Something had to be done. So new policies were put in place to allow those tax cuts for the very, very wealthy to expire and continue tax cuts for the middle class. Because higher wages, higher take-home pay increases aggregate demand in the economy. Aggregate demand creates economic growth. And as a result, since 2010, in the past 6 years, we created in this economy almost 16 million private sector jobs. You know, the American economy, we used to make things and sell them to the rest of the world. Now the things that we used to make and sell to the rest of the world, they make and sell to us. As a consequence, 70% of the American economy is consumption. So how do you create aggregate demand in the economy? You put more money in the pockets of more Americans as humanly possible, because here's what you know. They're going to spend it. And when they spend it, there's growth. I think, you know, you're always looking for silver linings in these different views of economic policy. And I think the one real clear silver lining here is infrastructure spending. And there's talk about $1 trillion bill, $1 trillion bill. And it does two things. In the immediate sense, it creates jobs. I think 43 jobs for every $1 million of investment in the construction trades and supply and materials industry. But the second economic benefit you get from that is when you invest in infrastructure, it unleashes the creativity and the resources of the private sector. So your views on $1 trillion investment in infrastructure, publicly financed, and don't tell me about deficit financing, because this nation spent $110 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Afghanistan. This government spent $76 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Iraq, both of which were deficit financed and didn't create one American job. So your views on infrastructure investment and financed in a traditional way.
Mr. Hall, you have 10 seconds to answer this, and I'm afraid, Mr. Higgins, that you did not leave him adequate time. I'm going to let him give a very brief comment, but if members would remember, if they're asking a question and they need to leave a little time for our witness to answer the question. Otherwise, if you could do briefly an answer, and then if there's more that you would like to do, if you could do that in writing, thank you.
Okay. I'll just say a basic principle I think is all over our work. You know, whether you change spending or change taxes, if you increase spending or lower taxes, or however, how you pay for that makes a difference, because the deficit has an impact on things. So if you increase spending but you don't pay for it, you increase the deficit, that makes a difference, how you pay for things. So that's something just to consider always with what we're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Dr. Hall, I appreciate your time and your service, and I'm happy to be on this bipartisan House Budget Committee. I say that a little tongue-in-cheek based on some of the comments that are made. The American people are tired of partisan bickering and tit for tat. They want us to do like they do in their businesses and in their homes and their daily lives, and roll up our sleeves and go to work and solve this problem. The other thing they're tired of is Congress playing by a different set of rules. And one of the rules that they have to play by and live by is that they have to live within our means. And so we've got to work together to solve this. I'm excited to be on this committee because I think it's the greatest threat to the future of our country. My commitment isn't to the Republican Party or to the leadership. My commitment is to my 3 children, that they will have a safe, strong, and free America to live in, that they will, in fact, have a future to grow up in the shining city on a hill, and this is the greatest threat to that future. And so I'm grateful to be a part of the problem-solving venture that we're about to undertake. I'm concerned I think there's spending issues and cuts to be made across the board, but I'm very concerned about the elephant in the room that was mentioned, that mandatory spending and the entitlement programs that were mentioned are squeezing very important investment that we need to make as a country if we're going to have a prosperous nation going forward. Now, I think about agriculture. Ag is the lifeblood of the economy in West Texas. And if we don't make the investment in risk management tools for our farmers or the safety net, we won't have the capacity to feed and clothe the American people. Dr. Hall, how much do we spend on the ag risk management or the ag programs within the Farm Bill as a percentage of our federal budget?
I don't know, but it's not a large percentage.
0.25%, so that we have a safe and affordable and abundant supply of food for the American people. But we've cut billions of dollars in that discretionary program. Whether it's transportation and making sure that we meet the transportation needs, or R&D so that we're the laboratory of innovation for the world and we continue to be on the cutting edge of technology in this country, or it's on national defense. I'm concerned about the lack of investment in these important areas, all because we're squeezing, we've squeezed, I think, just about all the blood out of the turnip on the discretionary side. At what point, Dr. Hall, do we reach diminishing returns on the cuts on the discretionary side, maybe in some of the programs I've mentioned?
Yeah, it's hard to say on any of this. You know, the growing deficit, any of these numbers, they look bad, and we've been on record to say that the debt is unsustainable if you look out a lot of years. So it's hard to say what's too much. Focusing on discretionary spending, one of the things I think is a little interesting, sobering factoid here is we expect in 10 years that just the payment on debt, the net interest on debt, will exceed all non-defense discretionary spending in the country. So that will become a bigger item than all non-defense discretionary spending. That's part of the problem. You have this net interest becoming a major part of the budget going forward.
Quick response of the risks to balancing our budget and getting our arms around this deficit spending and national debt. Which one is the greatest risk? Interest rates, economic growth, domestic spending, or the entitlement programs and the runaway cost there?
I mean, it's hard to rank them, right? Because obviously you can look at any of those or all of those to address the deficit problem.
Here's my last point, and again, thank you for your time. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. We don't have any more runway. We don't need more analysis. We don't need more accountants or budgetary experts. We need leaders with courage to solve the problem. The problem is mandatory spending. I look forward to getting after it, as we say in West Texas. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate following Congressman Arrington. We may not agree with much on economics, but he has shown a lot of graciousness in reaching out to the freshman class across the aisle and trying to build civility and put the country first. So I appreciate following him. Dr. Hall, thank you for your service, and your service not just in this role, but at the Commerce Department and Treasury Department and White House, and I look forward to hearing some of your expertise. I represent a district at the heart of Silicon Valley with Google, Apple, Yahoo, Intel, Cisco, and Enrico Moretti, economist at Berkeley, has written that there is a tech multiplier of 4.5 jobs. For every one job created in tech, 4.5 other jobs are created. Pastor Trieber and Pastor Burnell, who are in for the National Prayer Breakfast, will tell you that in our district, not everyone works at tech who goes to their church, but there are folks who are baristas and lawyers and others who have those jobs, partly because of the tech industry. Now, in eastern Kentucky, Thanks in part to Ranking Member Yarmouth's work with the administration, there was this model where 40 jobs recently were created of folks, coal miners' kids, being trained on iOS software on the Apple phone and Android software at Google phone, 4-month class, all of them have jobs. It was funded by the tech initiative that the administration worked on with Congress and the Regional Appalachian Economic Center. My question for you, and I don't think it's a partisan issue, is how do we get these tech jobs across the country? And what are your thoughts on what this Congress needs to do to make that possible?
Well, it's a little hard for me to speak too specifically to that, and I don't want to make specific recommendations. That's sort of not what CBO does. But I think in general terms, the long-run problems are, we talked a bit about the labor force participation, getting the labor force growth increase. We're getting working age people sort of back in the labor force. But there's also this productivity side of things. There are lots of things that government can consider that will help increase private sector productivity, right? Whether it's looking at tax policy, we're trying to find a more efficient way of collecting taxes that's hopefully tax neutral, whether it's looking at the regulatory environment, whether it's looking at increased federal investment. All those things are things that can impact private sector productivity. And that's really an important part of the recipe. One of the real difficulties anybody has right now in being too specific, we don't understand productivity growth very well. And we don't understand policies, how they impact productivity growth very well. So it's very hard for almost anybody to have too many solid recommendations on how to achieve higher productivity because we just don't know that much about it.
I appreciate that. Would you say that preparing folks for these jobs, though, has to be a component of it?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
The other line of questioning I have is slightly different, and that is on Social Security. And without taking a particular view, if we were to scrap the cap, how much revenue would that raise, and how much would that go towards solving some of the structural deficits?
It would certainly have an impact. I don't have the number in my head, but we actually did that calculation, and that options for reducing the deficit volume that we just produced, that was one of the little options that we put in there. If you look at that, and we can follow up too, give you some idea of how much of an impact that would have.
I'd appreciate that. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. We appreciate that balance of time. Thank you. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate the thoughtful comments from my colleague from New York and from California. And we do see things differently. And I want to bore down, though, on what my other colleague from California, Mr. McClintock, was getting at. In the danger of a sovereign debt crisis, I think it's much more real than people realize. And I think it's much closer than people realize. So you yourself have identified the debt as unsustainable, that we're on a path that we cannot possibly continue. And I think the numbers are compelling on that case. But what I'd like to flesh out is how this may be a nearer term event that would have cataclysmic consequences with regard to the value of our currency, with regard to future inflation, with regard to the American standard of living. I think it's interesting. I saw a McKinsey report the other day, and what it showed was we're at about 250% debt to GDP globally. And in the wake of 2008, what we saw was roughly a $57 trillion increase in debt, which was highly unusual, because what the report showed was that going back really over the last 50 plus years, actually, no, it was more than that, it went back to 1930, that in the wake of financial crisis or economic slowdown, that historically there was a deleveraging that followed. But that in this instance, post-2008, what we've seen is a reverse, a significant leveraging in the wake of financial crisis. And that therefore we lived in a time like no other, and you could see the same numbers at the federal level. You know, our debt to GDP numbers are at I guess a post-World War II high, and they're at a peacetime high. And so I was looking at numbers the other day, and I think this is a really interesting chart that again suggests how vulnerable we are and how a crisis could come much sooner than people realize. This is from the Fed, and it's net worth as a percentage of disposable income. You could also do net worth as a percentage of GDP. But basically what it shows is over the last 75 years, we've been really fairly constant at an average of around 500% net worth to disposable income. But that in the early, I guess late 90s, we had a peak. It represented the tech bubble. We went above 600%, and we did it again in the housing crisis, or just pre-housing crisis, went above 600%, and we've done it again now. And what's interesting is what followed the tech bubble, we know, what followed the housing bubble, we know, but we're at that same percentage in an overall inflated environment with regard to debt, both domestically and internationally. Is there a much greater level of vulnerability than we realize? And let me add one other thought to that. I pulled the numbers on economic expansions. We are now living in the 4th longest economic expansion in American history. So we had the tech bubble, we had the Reagan expansion, we had the Kennedy-Johnson expansions, but you know, the average is 60 months. We're about a third past that, which would suggest to me another layer of vulnerability. And finally, we live in a zero interest rate policy, which is a policy that we've, in essence, never lived in. You know, I guess it was Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary that at the time of the Depression talked about pushing on a string, how there was just no more juice in terms of making things happen. So would you flesh out in the minute and a half, I guess you have, a little bit of color with regard to, you know, while we may be unsustainable in the long run, maybe this could creep up on us much sooner than people realize?
Sure. Part of the trouble is that there just isn't research. There's no way to know of how much debt is too much.
Well, I mean, I think the law of, I mean, there's regression to the mean for a reason. I mean, I think it's even dangerous when we talk about interest rate policy and we say, well, we're going to go back to the average. Well, that's not what has historically happened. The reason you have regression to the mean is typically you go far on the other side. So interest rates go up a bunch to give you that average. So I think that the law of numbers and averages works.
Yeah, and the sort of comparison that we wind up making, and it probably should be a sobering comparison. 77% of GDP in debt is a really high number. You go up a little bit more and you have the highest debt ratio since the end of World War II. And the end of World War II was a pretty special time. So it's way above historical numbers.
Well, and that was a case when we were actually fighting for our survival as a republic. Right now, that money is in essence going toward consumption and, again, what many would argue to be unsustainable. Oh, we're going to have fun. Come on.
The gentleman's time has expired. I am very sorry. The ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Once again, thank you, Director Hall. I look forward to reading your new publication. I think that would be something mandatory, that reading for all of us here. One thing we haven't talked about yet during this hearing is tax expenditures. And I think your report shows that tax expenditures actually are on a path, if not now, they're larger than discretionary spending in total, including defense spending, somewhere going to $1.5 trillion. Is there any difference between $1 of tax in terms of the impact on the budget between $1 of tax expenditure and $1 of discretionary spending?
No, the effect on the deficits is the same.
And have you done an analysis of what types of discretionary spending maybe have a more positive or negative impact on the budget, as on the deficit, as you would have? So, for instance, the charitable deduction versus R&D tax credits versus mortgage deductions.
We have, and none of that comes to my mind so much. Our friends, our colleagues at the Joint Committee on Taxation are the ones who've done a lot more of that work. They might have some numbers for you.
And last year, this House renewed about $800 billion of tax expenditures, as I recall, with no offset.
For the numbers, that could be correct.
It was pretty substantial.
Yes, it was.
So when we're talking about, I hope you dealt with this in the new publication, because clearly when you're looking at over $1 trillion worth of tax expenditures, you're looking at another significant impact on the deficit, and something that we don't spend nearly enough time looking at in terms of which ones really pay off for the taxpayers. I mean, most of the mortgage deduction benefit goes to wealthier taxpayers, isn't that correct?
I think that's probably correct. Can I just say something in general, though? I've made I referred to it, but one of the ways to sort of try to improve efficiency and productivity is to look at the efficiency of taxes, of our tax system, right? Because our tax system has lots of things that encourages behavior that causes distortions. And so there are things one could look at. You know, reducing taxes on capital investment, for example, it's a really direct way of affecting productivity, because capital investment raises productivity. Worrying about our tax base, right? There's some offshoring behavior that reduces our tax base. Some of those things, especially if they're sort of tax neutral, would have an impact potentially on long-term growth without adding to the deficit.
Well, presumably we're going to have that debate later this year, and as the House takes on tax reform, so that'll be an interesting one. This is, I know, totally out of character for me, but I'm going to ask questions that have no political point at all. Just curious about them. In your report, you project Medicare spending per beneficiary to go up 4.3% through 2027, which is 3% higher than it's been over the last 5 years. Why such a dramatic increase in projection of the cost per beneficiary?
That one's actually pretty difficult for us to forecast. Healthcare spending has been consistently growing faster than GDP, and a lot of that for us is just continuing the trend that we've seen in that. And it's actually part of our forecast that will continue to per beneficiary growth of healthcare generally will grow faster than GDP, and that actually is part of the growing deficit.
But that hasn't been the case over the last 5 years, for whatever reason.
Right.
I mean, part of it's ACA, part of it's the economy, and so forth. I know there are a lot of factors involved there. But my point being, that could be totally, that could be a dramatic difference in your long-term forecast for Medicare if the growth rates per beneficiary stayed at 1/3 of what you're projecting.
Well, that's right. That could have an impact, and that you're right that the growth has slowed down. I don't know if we have it in this report, but somewhere we've got a little sensitivity analysis where we vary the cost of health care and to see what sort of impact that has on the budget deficit. We can get back to you on that, give you some idea.
Thanks. Another point you make is that the subsidies in the exchanges, assuming that they're not repealed, would double basically from this year till 10 years. And I was curious as to whether that's predicated on a doubling of the number of insureds, a rise in the premiums, so the subsidies have to keep pace with the premiums under current law. Is that the reason that they would double in 10 years, or is it a combination of both?
It's probably both, but we certainly, I think most of it is this increased use of the exchanges and increased use of the expansion, Medicaid expansion. So I think they're both in there.
Okay. So now turn to Medicaid. And so you project, this is on regular Medicaid, not the expanded Medicaid. Right. You project expenditures going from $389 billion in 2017 to $650 billion in 27, which is a significant increase. It's, I don't know what it is, 70% growth over that period of time, but it's 5.5% a year growth. Is that because you're projecting, again, rising cost per beneficiaries, or because you expect that many more people to be involved and be eligible for Medicaid, which would reflect a really bad economy? Or would it be because such a huge percentage of Medicaid is for skilled nursing, and you expect the senior population to eat up a larger chunk of the Medicaid budget?
Yeah, I have to get that level of detail. I have to get back to you. I'm pretty sure a big chunk of that is simply the increased number of people, but but we can break that out for you if you like.
Okay, but would it be on the skilled nursing side? Because, I mean, to say that the population eligible for Medicaid is going to grow that much over the next 5 years, again, indicates an economy that's going in the tank, which doesn't comport with the rest of your forecast.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we have not only we have pretty modest growth, but one of the things that we do have is a continuing trend in faster growth for income for high income folks. So the distribution of income, we have that continuing to change, and that's a trend going forward that's been there for a while.
Okay, and
that may be part of it.
Yeah, now going to Medicaid expansion, your projection is that between now and 27, the number of people in the expanded Medicaid would go from 12 million to 17 million people.
Right.
And that the total expense of expanded Medicaid would go from 70 billion to 142 billion. So that's a 100% increase. 7% a year is what you're projecting. Again, I'm curious as to why that's such a huge increase.
Okay, that one I know.
Okay, good.
Right now, there are 31 states and D.C. that have expanded, and that's about 50% of the eligible people. We expect that to increase, the number of states that adopt Medicaid expansion, and that will increase about 70% of the total people of all the states. Right. So it is from growing state acceptance of that.
And okay, it's a good answer. I wish we could see that. Policy doesn't look like it's going in that direction, however. You know, in my state, we have, I think, arguably the most successful expansion of Medicaid in the country. We reduced our uninsured by more than 60%. In my district, we're now at 3% uninsured. 81,000 people on expanded Medicaid. And the projections, if not your projections, but other projections, show that if we actually were to rescind the Affordable Care Act, the Medicaid expansion, or just the Medicaid expansion, we would lose an awful lot of jobs, tens of thousands of jobs in Kentucky. One estimate, 44,000 jobs, and $30 billion worth of economic activity over the next 5 years. Does your data and your analysis of the Affordable Care Act reflect that kind of potential loss in economic activity and employment in other areas of the country or across the country?
I'm not sure if we have that level of detail. You know, the main impact that we saw of, for example, ACA repeal is a change in the labor supply, right? And so we think that would be an increase in the labor supply that would sort of increase economic growth from repeal, and that would sort of counter some of the effects. That level of detail, I don't know offhand what we've thought about that.
Great. Well, thank you very much once again for your testimony. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Dr. Hall. Thanks for being here. As any other freshman here and probably other members as well, we've just come through a campaign where I know I've had many conversations with people throughout my district and heard concerns that they've expressed. And you know, one of the top things that we've heard is people believe that the economy is not working for them as it should. They believe, they're concerned that their kids, their grandkids, will not have the same opportunities to live the American dream that we all have had. People are very concerned about that. And they're concerned that we are asking future generations to pay the bill. And isn't it true, Dr. Hall, that it's what we're doing? If we cannot solve this problem here, we're transferring that problem to future generations.
I think that's a fair statement. We do have a little literature, a little research on talking about the intergenerational effects of the debt that we can get to you, but I think that's a concern.
So that's one concern. People are also very concerned. Their perception is that their elected leaders are not willing to make the tough decisions to solve the problems that we're faced with. And I'm hoping that we're about to change that. And I'm pleased to be on the Budget Committee to work to try to solve some of these difficult issues. And I agree with many of the other comments that have been said here today. This is not a partisan issue. These are issues that we should be looking to try to find solutions that will take us working across the aisle to move our country in the right direction. So I'm hoping that this is the beginning of finding some of those solutions. The other thing that I've heard, and I want to get to another question to you, I'm Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A lot of entrepreneurs, small companies who have grown, developed in technology or whatever it may be, and created jobs, more jobs. And the business owners that I talked to today believe that it is more difficult, and I was a business owner myself, and I've seen this as well. It is more difficult. There's less incentive to invest additional capital into new technologies, to hire people, because of the environment that we've created in this economy. They believe that the regulatory environment holds them back, holds individuals, holds businesses back, and prevents that kind of economic growth that we've seen before. They believe the tax policy is no longer working for them. Do you think we are seeing that kind of impact?
I certainly think that that's a potential area for improving the long-term growth, right? Because one of the two big challenges is productivity, and things like some regulation. You need some regulation. Some regulation.
Sure.
Eliminating some regulation to actually hurt productivity. But having regulation that's unnecessary or goes too far can impact productivity. Tax policies can impact productivity.
We've talked about whether we need to tax our way out of this, whether we need to cut spending. I think we also need to look at establishing the right environment to encourage capital investment, to encourage more hiring, to encourage activities by individuals and businesses that will create that kind of economic growth. I think it's been done before, but my question to you in this regard is, how much impact will that have? Say, for instance, we are able to get to a 3% or 4% annual growth. The numbers I'm looking at look every bit as bad and worse. They don't look any better from this side of this table than they do from before, but how much impact could we have if we create an environment for much stronger economic growth?
The problem is so big, you cannot do it just with economic growth, I think. And I think one of the ways to look at that is
can you give a sense, though, of how much difference that would make?
Well, right now, we think productivity is going to grow up to about 1.3% a year by the end of our 10-year period. In the 1990s, it was as high as 2%, which is very unusual. But let's say we got another 0.5 percentage point out of productivity. We're talking about, in 10 years, we're talking about having a deficit that's about $50 billion lower. So we're talking about the deficit going from 1.4 to 0.9. Right, that's an impact, but it's not balanced, and we still have the continuing worsening of the deficit from the demographics going forward.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Madam
The
Chair.
gentleman's time has expired, and I now recognize Mr. Faso from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Hall, thank you. You raised productivity. How much would making permanent the 179 tax incentive for business investment or 100% expensing for capital expenditures, how much would that, have you factored that into or done an analysis as to how much that could improve productivity?
I don't know if we've done an analysis on that. I mean, we assume that they expire when they expire. So I'd have to see if we've done an exercise like that.
Could you get back to us on that?
Sure.
And I'm also a member of the Agriculture Committee, and I was appointed to the Nutrition Subcommittee, and I've noted that despite the general improvement in the economy in terms of employment, that we still have not seen a decline in recipients under SNAP. And I'm wondering if you've factored in and looked at that factor as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of part of our forecast. We do think there's still slack in the economy. But the underlying forecast on SNAP, I think, does incorporate our economic forecast. We think we're still about 1.5 million jobs short of full employment right now, even though the unemployment rate's very low. So that's still a significant slack left.
And I would add some of the comments of my colleagues. One of the things I heard frequently on the campaign trail and speaking to businesses was that they have jobs, they just can't find qualified people to fill the jobs. And often these rely upon, these are jobs that might have technical skills, they might need some basic mechanical skills and training in robotics, etc. I'm thinking of one particular school near my district, Hudson Valley Community College, where the guy who runs it, it's a robotic training facility. He has about 150 students in it every year. Every single student has a job. He told me that you could have literally 50 of his type centers around the country, and you still wouldn't meet the need for employment of those kind of jobs. Any comment on that?
Well, two things come to mind. Our issue with a slowly growing labor force that's not growing as quickly, part of that is our working age people just aren't entering the labor force like they have in the past. So the participation rates of working age people now are really lower than they have been in the past. And that's a puzzle, right? And we think a lot of that just doesn't look like it's coming back. So that's something that's maybe important in here. And the second thing is, you know, one of the things that we have done a little work on is some federal investment in things like education and training. And in fact, we're coming out very shortly on a blog about what we see as the evidence on the effects of education and training that going forward that might address that issue.
Okay, I'd be interested in seeing that. I'm also interested in seeing that that publication you referenced about the 100 best ways we could use to reduce the deficit. And I think, speaking of the debt, what do you say our 10-year growth in national debt is going to be?
We're going to hit about 89% of GDP.
And in terms of actual amount of debt, it's going to go from, right now we're about 19 trillion to...
I think it's 30 trillion.
$1 trillion increase in the debt over 10 years. Does it get a little frustrating coming up here to Congress and to tell us and the American people that their national debt is going to be $30 trillion in 10 years and no one seems to pay attention?
Well, one of the things I notice every year when we put out this report, we do a little press conference, or we talk to press and let them ask questions. And one of the questions always is, what's new about this report? And the most notable thing to me is, well, what's the most notable thing is it's still got the same punchline it did last year and the year ago. Debt is large, and it's growing, and at some points unsustainable. That's a continuing message from CBO, and it's been that message for quite a while.
Well, Dr. Hall, thank you for your service. I wouldn't recommend it, but maybe you need to set your hair on fire when you're giving that presentation. Maybe they would pay attention then. Thank you so much. I yield back, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman yields back time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Dr. Hall, thanks for joining us today. Let me turn to direct spending or mandatory spending. You know, when I was first elected in 2010, the first phone call I got was from my nearly 80-year-old mother, and it wasn't to say congratulations. It was to say, all right, son, what are you going to do to make sure that Washington protects my Social Security benefits? Because if they don't, I'm coming to live with you. The next phone call I got was from my wife, who said, you better do what your mother said. For many years after the 1983 Social Security reforms, the Social Security Trust Fund ran fairly large surpluses. This was done deliberately to try to ensure the trust fund would have resources to pay benefits for a long time. So what is the current cash flow situation with Social Security?
Right now, their outlays exceed the revenues, even excluding interest, by a fair amount. This year, the outlays will exceed revenues by about $55 billion.
Wow. How long do you think Social Security will last at that rate?
Right now, we have our exhaustion date at 2030.
Okay. If Social Security continues to pay out more in benefits than it collects in taxes, what, in your opinion, will that mean for current beneficiaries if we don't take any action here? And I can guess at what that is. I can kind of put the two and two of what you just said together, but I'd like to hear it from you on the record.
Well, actually, our assumptions in this is that beneficiaries will still continue to get what they're promised. So even though, unless Congress acts, beneficiaries won't get their full outlays. We assume that happens. If they didn't, in 2030, benefits would just have to be reduced by about 29% right away.
All right. So, is it true the longer Congress waits to reform Social Security, the harder it is to implement the reforms without affecting current retirees?
It is.
Okay. Let me go back and talk a little bit about economic growth. You know, in a 2015 study on repealing the Affordable Care Act, the Congressional Budget Office determined that repeal would increase GDP by about 0.7% on average over the medium term. That's 2021 through 2025, mostly by repealing the provisions that are expected to reduce the supply of labor in the economy. So how would repealing the Affordable Care Act affect the expected supply of labor in the economy? Would it lead to an overall benefit for the economy in your view?
Repealing it would likely increase the supply of labor in the economy. Not quite 1 percentage point, and actually would give a boost to GDP growth because of that increase in labor supply. Of our latest estimate was about 0.7% on GDP.
Okay, so if we were to repeal, it would increase the GDP by 0.7, and the expected supply of labor. Tell me again what you think that would go to.
Sure. We think that the number of people who would increase their hours or increase or re-enter the labor force, that would increase by 0.8 to 0.9% of the labor force would be.
Okay.
That would be the boost to the labor force.
I'm asking you to do some mental math here. I know that, but at the current labor rate that we're experiencing, you got any idea how many millions of people that would be back in the labor force?
Right. I don't offhand. I don't want to guess.
Can you take that as a question, please?
We can do that pretty quickly. Somebody just needs to look it up for me.
Yeah, I need a calculator too. I'm sorry. So, hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate you answering my questions, Madam Chair. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I do want to reference the report that did come from CBO, budgetary and economic effects of repealing the Affordable Care Act. And I will read a line from this in addition to the questioning by the gentleman from Ohio. And the paragraph begins with the macroeconomic feedback effects of repealing the ACA would lower the federal deficits by $216 billion on the period from 2016 to 2025. So it would have a significant economic effect in lowering. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Hall, thank you for coming today. I guess one of the joys of being a freshman and going late in this game is I've gotten to hear a lot of these comments and have learned an awful lot. So a couple of questions for you. First of all, do you believe that the rules set by Congress that you have to follow for scoring the budget and the policy changes, do they allow us to accurately look into the future? Just yes or no?
Well, I don't have an opinion on that. We'll do whatever you like.
I would suggest that we're $20 trillion in debt. I'll let the answer stand for itself there. Next, can you accurately talk about how the proposed reforms, tax reform policy, the rolling back of the regulatory cost, possible trade policy changes, spending in defense, infrastructure, and poverty initiatives simultaneously affect the budget?
No, we'd have to see a lot more specifics and do a lot more work.
It just seems, you know, it's awfully tough for us to have an honest conversation if we don't accurately know where we're going with these numbers and how they're actually going to affect us. Do you think that we should be using more dynamic scoring models based in predictive analytics to give your office and those around you more tools to accurately reflect what the policy changes are going to suggest?
Well, I think the policy right now is working well. The dynamic scoring, we believe, makes for a more accurate forecast. And it really makes a difference on large pieces of legislation, and that's when we're required to use it. So that seems appropriate. We're going to continue to get better at it, quicker at it, but I think it does probably help improve the accuracy.
You know, as we sit around and we talk about this, the mandatory spending, and I think that we are going to have to be honest with ourselves and the American people about the promises that have been made and our ability to continue to keep those promises. We're going to have tough decisions to make, and it's, you know, I kind of look at it when we talk about where we are in the budget process. Are we going to have a budget that balances in 10 years? Are we going to have one that balances in 5 years? Is it going to be one that balances in 12 years? Are we not going to vote for a balanced budget because it ruins the political purity of a particular representative? I just get the sense, until we're willing to fundamentally address and honestly address the mandatory spending crisis, that we're not doing anything more than rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I want to be fair and say that there are a lot of ways you can address it. You don't have to just focus on mandatories, but the broader way that you address it,
Dr. Hall, you said earlier, I think the question, and I may be paraphrasing, that all of the spending, the mandatory spending, is going to outstrip all of the discretionary spending.
That's right, and the spending is mandatory. That's right.
So, I mean, it's coming. At some point,
Right.
that's going to eat up every single resource that we've got, so we have to address that. You know, the other thing, and I'll close with this, you know, it's interesting. I kind of feel like we're a political version of Thelma and Louise right now. We've been in this here, and we've been talking about who's been the better driver for the last 50 miles, okay? And now we're fussing about who's driving, and the car's about to go over the cliff. And it doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong if we don't stop that car from going over the cliff. The American people expect us to stop this car from going over the cliff, and I think it's going to be a real challenge that we have as a Congress and as an American people to have those very honest conversations that we've got to have. We've got to get better at scoring the budget. I believe we've got to get better at scoring the proposed changes. I think we've got to be able to strip the emotion and the politics out of our decision and use better analytics to make these tough decisions. And with that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grotham, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to take up again a little bit looking into why the economy is doing so poorly. You know, this 1.6% growth is kind of pathetic with all the new technology that's out there. Labor participation rate is 62.7%. And I want to talk a little bit more about these entitlements, because in the last decade, means tested spending has gone up from about 670 billion to 740 billion. So more than doubled. When you look at so many of these programs, it's like they were designed by politicians who intentionally either wanted to keep people out of the labor force or not making a lot of money. And I want you to comment a little bit on whether, say, if we did something about low-income housing, where we kind of give people almost free housing as long as you don't work, or the earned income tax credit, where we punish people if they make more than $19,000 a year. Do you think we could begin to lift these numbers up, lift up the GDP, as well as lift up our tax collections, if we would get rid of some of these programs and free people from the incentives not to work? I mean, in my district, my employers, again and again, I feel, Glenn, it's tough competition out there to find workers, and the toughest competition I'm getting is from the federal government that is paying people not to work for me. Could you comment on what would happen if we'd scale back some of these programs?
Well, sure. Obviously, we need some specifics to actually do a real score and do it carefully. And of course, repealing some of these programs would have some other effects that, that you might want to consider. But we do a number of things that, and we make a point of pointing it out occasionally, which are implicit taxes on working. That if people work more and earn more, they lose benefits, or if they begin to work, they lose benefits. So that is part of our calculation. When we look at something, we look and see what impact it has on the supply of labor, willingness of people to work, and that's a consideration.
Could you easily come up with a hypothetical in which people, say if they work and make another $10,000, lose $10,000 in benefits between their Pell Grants and their Earned Income Tax Credit and their food stamps and their low-income housing?
Right. Well, I mean, those are all reasonable versions of that. For example, we've been talking a little bit about the ACA. That's part of the issue about the ACA. That decline in the labor supply is essentially an implicit tax on working, where you lose your health benefits.
Right, and it's not just a decline in the labor supply. I think a lot of these programs will encourage you to work, but not very hard. Mm-hmm. You know, the Earned Income Tax Credit was clearly designed to discourage somebody from making more than $20,000 a year, right? I mean, that was what it was designed, appears what it was designed to do. There are various different cliffs in the Affordable Care Act. I was in a different hearing yesterday in which an accountant talked about people holding down their income to get the subsidies. So in other words, the Affordable Care Act was again designed by somebody who wanted to discourage Americans from working hard. Correct?
Well, I don't know that was a reason for it, but certainly looking at the possible side effects of programs, that what effects they may have on incentives is an important part of any public policy analysis, I think.
You think we could do both a great step towards reducing things on the spending side and getting a big increase on income collection if we pared back some of these programs and allowed people to work? When you run into people back in the district who have stories. Sometimes you don't talk to these people, but you talk to their parents, you talk to their siblings, and they'll tell you, my brother, my sister, my daughter, they're not working because of the benefits. Do you think we could make a big step towards balancing the budget if we pared some of these things back?
It would undoubtedly have an impact. I don't know that it would get us towards balancing the budget because this is such a big problem, but that could have some significant impact if one looked at some of the programs and worried about the incentives.
Well, means-tested spending, according to what I have here, went up about $370 billion over the last 10 years. I mean, that by itself would be almost halfway towards balancing our budget. And you turn around and look at the huge degree in which we discourage people from working, and all of a sudden you get that income tax coming in. I suppose you'd just be afraid to take a ballpark estimate on what would happen if...
Well, that's right, and there's an element too of a one-time change, and then part of what we're looking for is the more permanent change. What happens to not just the labor supply, but the growth of the labor supply going forward.
Well, thanks for coming over here. It's enjoyable listening to you.
The gentleman's time has expired. As we conclude today, I just want to clip off a few things to help us recognize what a situation we are in this country right now and how desperate we are to change the current trajectory that we're on. And so let me just clip off a few reminders. Real GDP grew only by 1.6% last year, a 5-year low and half the long-term average growth rate in this U.S. Since the recession ended in 2009, the economy has grown by an average of 2.1%, making this the weakest economic recovery of the modern era. The headline on unemployment rate has declined sharply in the recent years and currently stands at 4.7%. That all sounds good, but the other aspects of the labor market remain weak. The broader unemployment rate, which includes those working part-time because they can't find full-time work, and discouraged workers who have stopped looking for work, is 9.2%, nearly double the headline rate. The labor workforce participation rate, which I continue to remind people in my district as they hear the low rate that is on the unemployment rate, that really is the rate that matters. 62.7%. That means of able-bodied workers, only 62% of them are actually employed in a full-time employment. Close to a 40-year low, and CBO expects this rate to continue to decline in the future. CBO maintains that the Affordable Care Act is contributing to this decline by reducing the overall labor supply in the economy. The average hourly earnings have increased by about 2.5% over the latest year, but that is well below the pre-recession level when earnings were growing by about 4% a year. Real median household income is finally on its upswing, but at $56,500 is still $900 or 1.6% below its pre-recession peak in 2007. So as we can see by all of these statistics and these numbers, this is affecting our economy, and more importantly, this is affecting the people of this country. So thank you, Mr. Hall, for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and answers will be made part of the formal hearing. Any members who wish to submit questions or any extraneous materials for the record may do so within 7 days.
Madam Chairman, can I make just a brief comment in response to your comments?
Absolutely.
In listening to both sides and to Director Hall during this hearing, we heard very few ideas for stimulating growth in the economy or specifics about what we would cut or how we would fix some of the mandatory spending programs. So I think if it would be possible maybe to have another session sometime in the next few months to discuss the actual recommendations that are in the new publication from Director Hall, and then maybe get some other people in here who can talk about how we can actually grow the economy. Because I'm not exactly sure we know how to do that, either side of us.
Point well taken,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Yarmouth. With that, the committee stands adjourned.
You have radio at 12:30, so we gotta go back to the office. So you can.
Okay, that was okay.
Yeah.
I did get to that other thing, so.
No, it's okay. I'll get your paper.